Leave me alone.
Listen, before we start, make sure you hit that subscribe button because the story you are about to hear is not just horror, it's a warning. Because by the time Emeka realized the money he was spending was not really his, it was already too late. Something had started asking for payment. And this time, it wasn't money. It was his children. The day Emeka Nwosu buried his mother, he didn't cry. Not because he didn't love her, but because 7 months earlier, he had buried his father in that same red earth. At 19, grief had finished everything inside him. No inheritance, no relatives showing up with help, no miracle. Just 2 fresh graves and a decision he made quietly on his way home. If nobody would save him, then education would have to. So he walked. He walked the way only desperate people walk, without ego, without complaint, without the luxury of selectivity. He laid bricks in the sun. He hauled bags of rice at a depot before dawn. He cleaned office bathrooms at night with his engineering textbooks tucked into his bag. He did whatever was asked of him, and he did it without visible bitterness. While others were living life, Emeka was fighting it. And when his result came out, first class, top of his department. People who ignored him suddenly knew his name. Your life is set now. They said it like prophecy. Emeka believed them. He had done everything that was supposed to be done. He had paid every price the legitimate world asked of him. Surely now it would pay him back. It did not. The months that followed graduation was a slow, grinding humiliation that nobody warned him about. He printed CVs until the printing shop owner knew his face. He attended interviews where men in ties looked at his transcript with what seemed like genuine admiration and then never called. 1 year passed, then 2, and eventually survival dragged him to a roadside car wash where he stood under the sun washing cars for 800 naira each. 8 cars on a good day, 3 on a bad one. And every night he told himself the same lie. This is temporary. But deep down, he wasn't sure anymore. The one thing that kept the days from collapsing entirely was Ngozi, Pastor Ezekiel's daughter. A girl who had no business loving a man like Emeka, but she did anyway. She brought him food when he had nothing, sat with him when the world ignored him, and looked at him like he was already successful, not like he was struggling. That kind of love, it's dangerous when you're broke. Their relationship existed in stolen hours and careful silences, tucked away from her father's knowledge because Pastor Ezekiel was a discerning man, and Ngozi's happiness depended on him not yet knowing. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, 2 cars drove into the car wash. Not ordinary cars, the kind of cars that make the air around them feel different. And when the doors opened, Emeka's sponge stopped moving because stepping out were Daike and Obina, his university friends. Men he had eaten with in the cafeteria and studied beside in the library, and they were standing there, on the other side of a life he did not have, staring at him. The silence lasted only seconds. Emeka broke it with a smile, genuine and unashamed, because he had learned that a man who hides his circumstances from old friends loses both his pride and his opportunity. He told them plainly, no job, just managing, washing cars to survive. He watched something move through their faces. That evening, before they drove away, they pressed a thick envelope into his hands. 500,000 naira in cash. He stood holding it the way a man holds something he is not sure is real. They told him to meet them the next day on a private lounge on the island. That night, he lay on his mattress with the envelope beside him like a living thing, and he stared at the ceiling and felt for the first time in 2 years that the distance between where he was and where he needed to be might actually be crossable. He was right about that part. He was catastrophically wrong about the road. The next morning, he arrived in the lounge in his best clothes and sat across from his 2 friends. And small talk moved through the air for a while before Emeka leaned forward and said, "Whatever it is, whatever you need help with, I am ready." Daike and Obinna exchanged a look. And then Daike said quietly, the kind of quiet that fills a room, "Our money is not clean." Emeka's back straightened. He said immediately, "I am not harming anyone. I will not have blood on my hands." Obinna said, "No blood, no violence." And then what he said next made the entire room tilt sideways. He described in a flat and steady voice that for 1 full month he had consumed his own excrement once daily as part of a ritual. Emeka stared at him. Daike continued without any visible discomfort that for his own initiation, he had walked naked through public streets every 2 hours for 30 consecutive days. Emeka stood up. He said, "You two have lost your minds." And they watched him with patient eyes and said simply, "After the sacrifice, the wealth comes." He went home disgusted. He sat with the disgust. He let it fill the room. But that night, Ngozi knocked on his door. And one look at her face, everything changed. "I'm pregnant." Silence. "We need to marry before my father finds out." "With what money?" Emeka asked. She had no answer. And that night, Emeka didn't sleep. He just thought, calculated, weighed options, and by morning, he had already chosen. He called Daike. He said, "I am ready." They drove for hours into the interior, past towns that thinned into bush, until they reached a compound in a village where the walls were old and the air was thick with something that had no name in any language Emeka had studied. The old man inside, the dibia, looked at Emeka the way you look at something you have been waiting for. He said, "You will be wealthy beyond what your family line has known." Emeka asked, "What must I do?" The dibia said, "Sleep in a cemetery for 30 days. Emeka said, "Jesus," and took a step back. The dibia continued without reacting. After the first 30 days, twice a year, every year. And when you return home, your wardrobe will carry your reward. Obinna said on the drive back, "Keep your clothes dirty. Act like your mind is gone. Nobody in this country disturbs a madman in a cemetery." He went home and told Ngozi that an uncle had connected him to a month-long contract in another state. She held his face in her hands and said, "Come back soon." He nodded. That night, wearing clothes he had torn deliberately, carrying a small bag with nothing important inside, he stood in front of a cemetery gate in a city 3 states away, where his face meant nothing to anyone. And the iron gate exhaled a long creak when he pushed it. And the air on the other side was different in a way that his body registered before his mind did. And he stood there at the threshold for a moment that felt much longer than a moment. And then he walked in. The first night was the longest of his life. He did not sleep. He sat on a concrete grave slab with his knees pulled up and his heart behaving badly. And every sound the night made became a presence. Leaves moved by wind sounded like feet. A rat crossing nearby sounded like something deliberate. When headlights swept across the cemetery wall from the road outside, he shouted into the dark the way a disturbed man would shout, "Leave me alone, get away from me." And the headlights kept moving, and no one came near. He survived the night. He survived the next. By the 10th night, the fear had not disappeared, but it had changed shape, becoming something more like background noise. By the 30th night, he was counting hours like a man finishing a prison sentence. When he came home and opened his wardrobe, The money was there, stacked, dense, real. He laughed, and then he was crying, and he wasn't entirely sure when one became the other. He called Ngozi and said, "Prepare yourself. We are doing a proper wedding." And they did. The traditional ceremony was everything, loud and colorful and abundant, and attended by people who had not thought of Emeka in years, but arrived with gifts and wide smiles and both hands extended, the way people show up when they can see that a man has arrived somewhere. Ngozi was radiant. Her father, Pastor Ezekiel, looked at his son-in-law with guarded approval, sensing something he could not articulate, filing it away for later. Every 6 months after that, Emeka told Ngozi he had a contract out of state. He would pack a bag and travel to another city and dress in rags and sleep in a cemetery for 30 days and come home to money. He built a filling station, then a second one, then a small hotel, then a larger one. He opened a logistics company. The businesses generated visible revenue, so the money made structural sense to anyone looking at it from outside. And nobody looked too closely, because prosperity makes people comfortable, and comfortable people do not ask difficult questions. Children came, a son, and then twin daughters, and then another son. Years accumulated. 10 years of this life, this double life, this architecture of normalcy built on a foundation he tried never to examine in daylight. Then Daike called and said, "Can we meet?" And something in his voice was missing, some frequency that had always been there. And Emeka noticed it immediately when he arrived at Daike's house, because the room felt like a room after a fight, too quiet, too still, everything slightly wrong. Daike was moving around without settling. He said the money is slowing down. Contracts are falling apart. The businesses are bleeding. But you are still doing your ritual, Emeka said. Every time, Daike said. Then what is the problem? Daike stopped moving and looked at him. I went to the Dibia, he said. He said the spirits have been satisfied with what we have offered for 10 years. Emeka waited. He said they now require something at a higher level. Emeka's chest tightened. What level? Daike's voice dropped until it was barely sound. He said I must bring him the head of a virgin girl. The room held that sentence for a long time. Emeka repeated it slowly, like a man making sure he heard correctly. Daike nodded. His hands were shaking, in a way that hands shake when the body has taken in something the mind cannot process. He said he told the Dibia he could not do it, and the Dibia said then prepare for consequences. Emeka went home that night feeling scraped out. 3 weeks later, the news came through a mutual contact. Daike had died in his sleep. No illness, no deterioration, just alive in the evening and gone by morning, the way a candle goes when someone covers it with their palm. At the burial, Emeka stood far enough from the coffin that he did not have to look at it directly. He found Obinna afterward and said, "This is not a coincidence." And Obinna looked at him with eyes that were calm in a way that was more frightening than panic, and said, "Mine has changed too." "Changed to what?" Emeka asked. Obinna said 5 newborn babies every 6 months. Emeka looked at him for a long time and said, "You are doing it." And Obinna said, "I have been doing it for a year." He said, "I will not go back to nothing." Emeka walked away without another word and drove home and sat in his living room in the dark after his family was asleep and looked at the photographs of his children on the wall, one face and then the next and then the next, and he said out loud to the empty room, "No, I am finished with this." He did not return to the cemetery. 6 months came and went. Then his phone rang early one morning, and the Dibia's voice came through it, unhurried and almost gentle, saying, "My son, did you think a covenant forgets you? Come and see me this weekend." The line ended. He went, because refusing to go felt more dangerous than going. He sat across from the old man and explained that he was stopping, that he was done, that he would walk away from the whole arrangement. And the dibia listened with an expression that was close to amusement and then said, "You collected from this for 10 years, Emeka. You cannot simply decide it is finished." Emeka said, "I will not touch blood." The dibia looked at him flatly and said, "Then continue the original sacrifice. 30 days, twice a year, as agreed, or consequences come for you." And the meeting was over. That night, Emeka was in a cemetery again, in a city no one knew him in, wearing torn clothes, standing in the cold. He told himself it was only 30 days. He told himself this was manageable. He sat down in the dark, and then a voice said, "Go." So quiet he thought he imagined it. He looked around, nothing visible. Then the word again, louder, "Go." And then the shapes began to appear between the graves. Not animals, not people. Figures moving toward him with a steady, unhurried purpose. Faces colorless, eyes like holes. He called out in his madman voice, "Leave me alone, back away." And a pedestrian outside the gate paused and said to no one in particular, "Who is this man shouting at the air?" The blood in Emeka's veins went cold because he understood exactly what it meant that the person outside could see nothing. The figures were now close enough that he could feel the temperature drop. They said "go" together in a sound that was not quite voice and not quite anything else. And he ran. He ran past the gate into the road and did not stop until his legs refused to continue. And when he turned back, the cemetery was perfectly still, the gate closed, the night unremarkable, as if the thing he had just experienced was entirely private. He was at the shrine before sunrise. He didn't knock. He pushed the door open and said, "They chased me. They drove me out." And the dibia looked at him and smiled slowly and said, "Yes, it is time." "Time for what?" Emeka said. "For something greater," the old man said. "What do they want now?" The dibia's expression became the expression of a man reading a document. He said, "They want your children. All of them." Emeka's legs went. He was on his knees without deciding to be. He said, "Not my children. Take everything else. Everything I have built. Take it all." The dibia said, "They already gave you everything else. That was the arrangement. Now the arrangement has progressed. Give them the 4 children. And if you are sensible," he added quietly, "begin producing more." The drive home was something he has no clear memory of. He parked in front of his house and sat in the car for a long time before he could go inside. In the days that followed, he was a ghost of himself in his own home. He snapped at Ngozi without cause. He could not sit in the same room with his children with a feeling like drowning. He avoided their eyes because looking at them felt like looking at something he was about to lose. Then one night, a scream came from his eldest son's room. He and Ngozi ran in together and found the boy sitting up in bed, rigid, shaking, pointing at the television set which was off, had been off for hours, saying, "Daddy, something came out of it. Something came out and stood there and said my name." Ngozi held him and said it was only a dream. Emeka stood in the doorway and said nothing because he knew it was not a dream and he knew exactly what it was, and he could not say any of that out loud. He did not sleep. In the morning, they went to the boy's room to wake him and found him cold, still, gone, 10 years old and gone. And Ngozi's scream that morning rearranged something permanent inside Emeka that would never fully return to its original position. Pastor Ezekiel came the same day. He prayed through every room in the house, and after he was done, he looked at his daughter with the careful eyes of a man who has seen darkness up close and knows its texture. And he said, "This is not natural grief. Something has been invited here." Emeka sat in the corner of the room and said, "I need to confess." And he told them everything: the dibia, the cemetery, the covenant, the 10 years of rituals, the money that had come from all of it. He told it plainly, without decoration, because there was no point in anything except plainness now. Ngozi wept in the way people weep when the loss is not only of a person, but of a version of reality they believed in. Pastor Ezekiel sat in silence for a long time when it was finished, and then he said, "You should have come before now, but we are going to fight this." He told them to leave the house that same night and bring the remaining 3 children and come into the church premises. You cannot stay under this roof. Pack only what is necessary. They moved into a small apartment in the church compound and began fasting, and Emeka prayed for the first time in 10 years with the desperation of a man who has exhausted every other option. 3 days in, the Dibia's voice arrived through his phone. "Leave the church grounds or what comes next will be worse." Emeka ran to Pastor Ezekiel with the phone still in his hand, and the pastor said, "What you bound yourself to has no jurisdiction inside this place. Your children are covered here. Trust what you are doing and do not move." That night, one of Emeka's filling stations burned to the ground. The next evening, his hotel. 2 days after that, his logistics depot and the fleet of trucks inside it. His second hotel. His property systematically, one after the other, until there was nothing left that could burn. And then his bank account emptied in a single morning, as though the money had simply decided to stop existing. And Emeka sat on the floor of the church apartment and pressed his face into his hands and let himself cry completely. No composure, no performance, just a man emptied of everything he had spent 10 years accumulating. Pastor Ezekiel sat beside him and said quietly, "What was built in darkness is being reclaimed by darkness. This is how these things end when you choose to leave them. It is painful, but your children are breathing." He was right about that. The 3 remaining children were alive and safe, and that had to be enough, and Emeka decided in that moment on the floor that it was. The life that followed was small in all the ways that the previous decade had been large. Emeka carried market goods on his back for daily wages. Ngozi set up a provision table near the church gates and sold sachet water and biscuits and phone credit. They ate carefully. They accepted help from the church without pride getting in the way, because pride is a luxury that requires a certain minimum threshold of security, and they were below that threshold, and they both knew it. Ngozi barely spoke to him for a long time, not from cruelty, but from a wound that needed space around it. One evening, she said, "I am not leaving you, but I cannot pretend I am fine yet." He said, "I know." He said, "I do not deserve it to be fast." And that was the most truthful conversation they had in years. 2 years passed like this, slowly, honestly, without event. Then he submitted a CV again, not from confidence, just from the discipline of a man who keeps moving. And the response came back within a week, and he sat across a panel of engineers who looked at his transcript and his years of experience managing physical infrastructure, and they offered him a position that came with a salary that had 8 figures before the decimal point. Legitimate oil sector work that asked nothing of him except his actual knowledge and his actual hours, and he accepted it in a voice that he had to work to keep steady. He drove home that afternoon and pulled up in front of the church compound, and his 3 children were in the yard, and they looked up and started running toward the car, and he got out and crouched down and held all 3 of them at once, and over their heads he could see Ngozi watching from the doorway, and her face was doing something complicated and private. And he held his children tighter and understood something with a clarity that only arrives after you have lost a great deal. That wealth can appear overnight. He had seen that with his own eyes. But peace, the specific peace of a man who has nothing to hide and no voice calling him back and no covenant waiting in the dark, that peace does not arrive quickly. It arrives slowly, honestly, at the pace of things that are real. And he understood one other thing, The thing that everything in his life since that first cemetery night had been building toward. The thing the Dibia had never said out loud, but that was embedded in every transaction from the beginning. That in this life, absolutely everything has a price. The only question is whether you understand what you are agreeing to pay before you sign. Emeka understood now. He had paid in full, and he was, at last, free. If this story gave you chills, you already know what to do. Subscribe, because the next one might be even darker.